Hello and welcome to MySecTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media. And today we're going to be joined by Dr. John Coyne, Head of Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We're looking at Operation Ironside, which was Australian Federal Police and police agencies from across Australia, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, harnessed an encrypted app and captured underworld circles worldwide. The stories continue, but again, John and I have spoken before. John's been on our channels. We'll have a look at the implications of this, not just for organised crime, but also for the likes of policing, as well as encryption itself and encrypted apps. Just as a background, we cover on aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. We should be streaming on YouTube, LinkedIn and Facebook. Our main Facebook page is the Asia Pacific Security Magazine. And we'll probably put this one out as well on the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast. And we haven't allocated ourselves a time on this one, but so we may well go up for the full hour, depending on this. It's a big topic, and John and I will go deep into different areas. Just as a background, what we covered off on Friday, we looked at MicroX has now opened up in the USA with their X-ray technology for airport security. And thank you to Peter Rowland and Brian Gonzalez there with MicroX. And we also looked at X-Tech and their Memorandum of Understandings with Milram Robotics and Athena Artificial Intelligence with Philippe and Scott, both good sessions. Today, we continued with episode 3 of our Security Consultant Insights series, and we looked at building automation systems and the security function. Thank you to our sponsors, Davcore and 6Clicks and the consultant panel. That session is now available for on demand on our Learn Security platform. And next week, as a heads up, we've got a new consultant panel looking at video surveillance systems and crime prevention through environmental design with Cody, Luke Percy-Dove and Fraser Holmes joining us. Also next Tuesday afternoon for our Tech and Sec Weekly, we're going to be speaking to Brian de Carys, the Chief Executive Officer with ASIAL, the Australian Security Industry Association, and looking at how we should be recognising the critical role of the frontline security industry and some of the politics around, particularly around mutual recognition of licences in Australia. And also next week, next Thursday, we've been joined by Steve Rainville from Canada and SIDEF, and looking at defending critical infrastructure from ransomware attacks. And that one is going to be at 2:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. And that's in conjunction with the Aerospace and Defence Consultants Association of India. Also highlighting our endpoint of singularity, again on endpoint protection with Sentinel-1, and thank you to Evan Davidson and Kelvin Lee on that. That is also out as a podcast on the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast, and highlighting Microsoft there with Jane Lowe, our Singapore correspondent, and her interview with Microsoft's General Counsel and Regional Lead, and how Microsoft took legal action against the to disrupt TrickBot malware. Please call out for contributions to issue 5 of the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine. And thank you to our series sponsors, IT Glue, Secure ID and RSA Business, the ALC, Cybersecurity Certification Courses, and a new one today for Security Expo, the Security Exhibition and Conference. So if you're in Sydney or on the East Coast, you should be able to get over to Sydney for the ICC Sydney 21 to 23rd of July on Elevated Intelligence with Secure Exhibition and Conference. If you want to support the channel, our Cyber War series is on our merchandise, and that is enough for me. And let's bring on Dr. John Coyne from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and Head of Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement. John, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Chris.
Great, mate. It's been a little while, so it's the first that we've had you on for the year. But some big news on Operation Ironside and the Australian Federal Police. And we've broadly kind of interviewed over this, as ASPI often does on these types of issues. Maybe introduce us to Operation Ironside, your initial kind of take on it, and then we'll look at sort of the 3 pillars of the implications, both for organised crime, for policing, and then for encryption. So, yeah, your initial thoughts on Operation Ironside.
Chris, I'm smiling because you as an old police officer or an ex-police officer,
Yeah, we're both ex-cops, so that's one. Take that away.
it's a huge
Disclosure.
week. Uh,
It
it's
is a big week.
it's a huge week in law enforcement nationally, globally, and for our communities. And I put that sort of shout out to my ex-Australian Federal Police colleagues and more broadly their collaborators and stakeholders. An unprecedented operational success, and which we'll go through in a second. If you're looking to buy some movie rights, if you could buy the movie rights to this one, I think you've got a really good chance at going right for the Oscars. So let's go back a few years, and mobile phones have come on. We'd moved from analog to digital. Okay, so law enforcement found themselves all of a sudden up against two things: the most secure communication the bad guys could get their hands on, which is a combination of Blackberries and stripped out Blackberries with a lovely app called Phantom Secure. Now, it took a number of years and some really amazing collaborative work between the various Five Eyes law enforcement groups. So, this group is, cooperation between New Zealanders, Canadians, US, Australia, UK, and finally they got there. Now comes the sort of really great story about this, is that they finally arrested a number of criminals who globally have been using Phantom Secure. Having secure comms is critical in that business. So having a few beers, an American and Australian, and this sounds like a joke, but and something I'm making up, but they're sitting there talking, going, what if we created our own Phantom Secure and then marketed it? And thus begins the story of what we saw eventually play out last week, which is getting a stripped out phone, creating a piece of encrypted software called ANoM. Now, then getting assistance to make sure that they can decode it, decrypt it in near real time. And that in itself would have been an amazing feat. But then, I was talking about it before we came on, a lot of older senior management police now and younger police, they'll say policing's all about the tech, especially when it comes to transnational serious organised crime. Now, this story seems like just a tech story, but it gets even better there. So what these guys did is, through human source undercover, were able to get crooks to take up and adopt using these ANoM platforms. Then all of a sudden, globally, if they start petering around the place, going around, people are taking them up from word of mouth in the criminal community. All the while in the background, there's a really great quote from last week from the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, Reece Kershaw, which was, these guys put handcuffs on themselves. It's just a truly amazing story, enabled by a range of different parts and sliding stories. Good luck. But probably most importantly, a combination of old school skills like human source, etc., and something that I've been harping on in my own research, and I've talked about in the past, which is a sense of entrepreneurialism, and not the old school entrepreneurialism, but an innovation in law enforcement. And I think this is a true example of that, and global cooperation, and we're seeing those arrests play out now. We could say the last week has been an amazing. The figures are fantastic. 20 threats of death, threats to kill have been disrupted. Hundreds of guns taken off the street.
Let me read out some, John. So since 2018, they've been reading the presumed secure ANoM messages that resulted in last Monday's raids. So state police agencies and the AFP arrested 224 people on 526 charges. With simultaneous raids around the world. Now, I understand there's been another 60 plus arrests this week across multiple jurisdictions. They collected 20 million messages and monitored activity on 11,800 devices. And this is what brought us to discussing the implications of that on that many messages, that many devices, that many arrests, and the intelligence that they get from this. I think you touched on the innovation that is this being so innovative, being across jurisdictions, involving the FBI in Australia. How much implications does this have? Because they learn how to work with each other. That's a big outcome as well at a site, just police force to police force.
Yeah, look, I think there's a range of factors here that we need to take into consideration. So I'm going to keep on reiterating because I've got a lot of colleagues, friends, and who are in the policing community. So number one is just these amazing numbers that you've just read out in cooperation. Okay, so let's put that to the side for a moment.
And I'll note it, even from my background, that is a big operation, and I don't know how big that is, but that in terms of the scale of in Australia, there's been bigger investigations, but on an operational level,
thousands of police,
huge.
Chris.
That's huge.
Yep, thousands of police across the countryside, and then thousands more across the globe. So and that's something to be celebrated. I think also what it did is it gave an unprecedented look inside the hood of transnational serious organised crime and organised crime in this country. So it turned around and gave, and I think this is the most important part, and there's two parts of this. First is that it gave us a capacity to understand like never before how the crooks operate, how the facilitators, so these are the people who are accountants, lawyers, people working in the border environment, how they operate and engage with each other, and that's unprecedented. And what that's going to give us, which is the second part, beyond the arrests, and I'll go in a second, I'll talk a bit about long-term impacts of those, but beyond the arrests, if government have got a real opportunity here, and the government at various levels in Australia and elsewhere, to use that understanding of the vulnerability. So not just to take out those lawyers, those accountants, those people working in the border
professional service providers overall.
That's right. Not just to take those ones out, but to really close off the vulnerabilities that allowed them to become corrupt. So there's some real heavy lift policy work to do there, and it's a big questioning amongst industry and association groups. So that's amazing.
And just on that, I haven't read too much on those second tier. We mentioned professional service providers, stockbrokers, all accountants, as you mentioned, and lawyers. There hasn't been a lot of outcomes on corruption at this stage, but I imagine that may well come at a second level.
Look, I think there's a lot more to come here, and this was the clear message that the authorities, Australian Federal Police, and indeed Commissioner, and indeed the PM said, which is in Australia here, which is this is going to go on for months and months, and perhaps even years, as they unpack those 20 million communications and start doing some real data crunching and link analysis and temporal analysis. We're going to see, and some of that's done already, but we saw the worst taken out. What we're going to see now is significantly a large number of arrests. Now, I think in terms of lasting impact, and this goes into that's the good news and the bad news. So I think right now in terms of the drug market, so definitely the Australian component of organised crime has been heavily impacted. Those middle level dealers and facilitators will be panicking about now, and over the last week, they'll be pushing whatever drugs they're holding down to the street level.
Or down the toilet.
Or down the toilet. And we'll see a lot of that. Unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of people will owe a lot of other people a lot of money without being tongue-in-cheek, but they're all glib about it. But there'll be a lot of, I suspect, reckoning across the organised crime community following this. And that's a risk, and that's something that the AFP Commissioner mentioned, that he had spoken to the state and territory jurisdictions during his press conference last week. So I think that we're going to see that. Over time, I think the price at street level, which has historically been stable in this country for methamphetamine and cocaine and heroin, I suspect the prices of those will rise. Now, some people say, isn't that fantastic? But unfortunately, those addicted to drugs don't have a tendency of saying, well, my point of heroin was $50 last week and now it's $100, I will give up. What they tend to do is commit more crimes. And I suspect, we've got ourselves probably 6 months to a year to really be prepared for that next wave of those people who are going to enter the market to become wholesalers and organised crime figures to replace those who've been taken out.
And just on that, we had you on early last year during COVID, as that was kind of unfolding, or after COVID was unfolding. How would their comms have changed during COVID? Because obviously that drug trade was implicated by lockdowns and the like. So I imagine their electronic comms went up during COVID. So, even on these types of encrypted communications, it might have even increased the chatter and the traffic anyhow.
Look, I suspect so, and the hint that comes from the Australian Federal Police is that's the case. The key here was again going back to the components of tech, innovation, and of course good old-fashioned human source work and undercover work, which is these people were convinced that they were operating without anyone listening to them. So this is just one of many platforms. So I don't think every organised crime figure in Australia had taken up and to use ANoM. So there's still going to be others out there. There's other platforms, but the other thing we haven't sort of talked about is that people asked me, and over the last week they've said, wonder why the AFP and the FBI, their partner, would tell everyone about this. And I said, well, I think they would have had to. There's a point at which you have to release, and you have to call it a day in terms of that sort of intelligence collection, because you run the risk of, if someone was killed, you held information, etc. So I think it had run its course.
They would have. I'm sure they were presented with that decision a number of times over the period, even after that first, because as you said, there was some 20 sort of death threats and plans, even a potential, was it bombing or a public shooting?
Public shooting against a family. And so, I think they had to do that. But the other part, ingeniously, the lasting impact, at least for a little while after this, will be that no one's going to trust anyone, and they're going to be looking at every future platform they use. Now, the downside of that, and the reality is that there's always good points and bad points when it comes to these sorts of developments. I think that what we've probably seen. I'm not writing a how-to guide, but round about now, if you wanted to sit there and sell something to organised crime, a secure platform is exactly what they won't be looking for, or another way of making sure that platforms are secure. So between you and I think that's one of those challenges, Chris. We've probably created another market for providing secure comms out of this.
Well, again, or they can't use it for an extended period of time. That's part of one of the key implications, isn't it? That both the methodology of communication, if you are on the dark side, and how you communicate, whether it's code word, if it is encrypted, how long you can use that for, and how safe that is. But then also policing methodology, understanding that there's going to be a pivot on the dark side against this. But as you pointed out, traditional human sources were still involved in this. So at the end of the day, as long as there's a person at the end of that device, there's always a vulnerability, even in cybersecurity. There's always vulnerabilities with people.
Look, I think that's the case, and I think that one of the things that are lost on people, though, is that each new, and as years have gone by, for those of the audience who've worked in signals intelligence or on telephone intercepts, the encryption software and capabilities are going ahead leaps and bounds, and for law enforcement and national security to keep up with that has been incredibly challenging. Why else would you have? You had the director of the FBI saying, we're going dark. Now, on this occasion, they were able to, using these very specific set of circumstances, address going dark. But I'm not 100% convinced longer term that's still a viable option. So, I think encryption is going to still be a really difficult challenge, and certainly a key enabler for transnational serious organised crime. The borders don't look like they're going to be opening anytime soon. So if you want to do a criminal deal, if you want to be able to talk to your partners offshore, you have to find a mechanism for doing that's secure. So I still think it'll be attractive. It's just which platforms do you trust, and how do you know which ones to trust? But you and I both know this. We made a joke about it earlier, but not all organised crime figures and those involved in organised crime are exactly the smartest people. Some of those most lasting in that area certainly have smarts and are able to innovate rather quickly, and I suspect those are the ones who are going to be the early adopters.
Well, you touched on encryption, and I think it was the last week or the week before, the timing was impeccable in terms of the Internet Society released a report on the economic impacts of our encryption laws. And there's on the ABC, they've got an article out that there was no arrests in the US related to this operation because of the privacy laws protected them. They couldn't use some of that evidence. What have you seen or your observations around, say, the Toller Act and the change to our Telecommunications Act and the encryption, is that good or bad? Are you hearing sort of mixed on that?
Look, there's a couple of things with that. So for a number of countries, and
because the industry doesn't like it, and
that's understandable too. A number of countries were able to successfully use Operation Ironside information to undertake arrests and operations. And it's my understanding the FBI did make some offshore arrests,
but maybe not in the US. Then, yeah.
But I think there's no doubt that the act itself. And yourself from experience, coordination and cooperation in terms of transnational serious organised crime across jurisdictions, it's very, very challenging. It's challenging for the federal authorities here in Australia to work with the state and territory authorities. It gets significantly more difficult when you're talking globally. So it's not unusual that you don't get a clear lineup in terms of encryption. So in my personal viewpoint, I often do this, and I'm guessing many in your audience will probably have a better understanding of encryption than I do, but encryption is the lifeblood of our 21st century. So in some ways, how the encryption debate plays out in the mainstream media and then in the alternative media is particularly unhelpful because it creates a binary context, which is, government are evil and trying to take your data on one side. On the other side, encryption allows criminals to do things. My viewpoint is this, which is that encryption is the lifeblood of the 21st century. I can't go online to successfully, do banking, book tickets, or anything else like that without encryption. So it's a necessary thing. Now, the concept that amongst some policymakers that you can put a magic backdoor in there, or similar concepts to that, as a number of the people listening here today will understand the maths behind it, which is I don't think that's particularly possible. And in fact, what it does is it eats away at the at our lifeblood. So from that perspective, I think that I'm not convinced that it's all about the laws and all about Toller. And I also think we need to be very, very careful about the idea of propagating the discussion or policy or discourse around today. This worked in Operation Ironside, so we need more of this legislation.
Yeah.
What we need in this country is more innovation in our law enforcement and more international cooperation between law enforcement agencies. And the proof of that was Operation Ironside.
I think
having the right law is important.
Well, it's a good point it'll be interesting to see where that legislative creep goes. We definitely saw it, say, after 9/11 and the like, but I think, we're seeing it with child exploitation. You see this at serious transnational organised crime where, I think it's a good message for the public that, one, the police agencies are active, they're innovative, they are using the legislation that does come into play. But I think you're right. As long as we don't get legislative creep coming into play is a good thing. Now, let's maybe touch on policing itself and all the agencies and, as you say, potentially thousands of police involved, the intelligence that this builds up for them. You touched on how they communicate, but also, there's some, we talked about 224 people arrested. There's serious organised crime, the bikies. Some of them are in a bit of hot water, the potential implications for them giving evidence against others, the amount of deals going on. There's a lot here. What are the implications for policing itself into the near future?
Look, there's no doubt. And there's some throwaways I'm going to say to you here, which you'll probably go, that's a no-brainer, but I think it's important that we clearly articulate it. So number one is that, the old concept of an investigator having those same skills that a police investigator had 10 years ago, I think they're completely out the window now. When you're talking about
now.
Yeah, that's not true, mate. But you know what I mean? Like, I think, a police officer needs to be able to deal with big data analytics. They need to be able to use self-learning or develop and work with data scientists to find the pieces, that magic slithers that only come from being able to look at the whole of the information, not just little pieces in terms of evidence. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. So there's some real changes to how law enforcement are going to need to operate. I also think, though, that it sort of reiterates those earlier points I was making around cooperation, and around our understanding of cooperation and our understanding of how organised crime groups go. So, I've a doctorate, but I'm not an academic, really. I don't like the term particularly, but I'll do what I always say we don't want to do, which is, we find our modern understanding of transnational serious organised crime comes out of a work by a guy called Donald Cressy, who did some significant work for the US government in the late 60s, early 70s. At the time, he studied Italian organised crime. And so he came up with this sort of concept of hierarchical organisational structures. And shortly thereafter came out concepts of, and we've seen this play out over the last several decades, which is this concept of decapitation theory. Okay, so Pablo Escobar. Okay, so we understand his organisation, or we did do, as being this hierarchical structure. If we take Pablo out, then it all falls over and everything's okay. Well, actually, that's not what occurred at all. We ended up with a far worse situation. The Teflon Don Gotti himself, they take him out and all these key leaders of his family, etc. His group is still operating in New York to this day. Maybe not as big, and it's taken a while to get back, but they're still operating and had no lasting impact on organised crime there. If we go and have a look at, if we look at Mexico, it's the same problem. We went and applied the same theories that were against Pablo Escobar, and what's happened with the cartels there? Nothing. Okay, Sichi Lop and the company, he's been detained in the Netherlands, being brought back here. Have we seen any change in terms of drug production in Myanmar? Look, I think not. So what we've found, though, and this is the really interesting part of this Operation Ironside, which is all of a sudden we understand, and if you listen to the AFP commissioner talking about this last week, he turns around and goes, we had outlaw motorcycle gangs here, and some of their members were doing things as part of the gang, and then they were doing things over here elsewhere. Now, I've been using a term since I did my PhD, so more than 10 years, I've been using this term called amorphous. I really like it because, it makes me sound smart, but separately from that, on a serious note, it's like gas, amorphous, without shape. And I think that transnational serious organised crime is more amorphous than it is structurally bound. So yes, you will find at times people are operating, and you can see it right down to individual OMCG level. So at times you'll see an OMCG chapter working together, at other times as part of a broader pattern of clubs. And then other times individual members themselves, by those gangs' own admission, do criminal activities. So I think that, what this has done is finally given that evidence. Now, that's a tough one and a bitter pill to swallow, because if you think back over all of our intelligence, all our policing and intelligence activities when it comes to transnational serious organised crime, we all say if you take out Mr. Big, it generally is Mr. Big, but if you take out Mr. Big, that the whole thing is going to fall over. So I think it really brings into doubt some of that decapitation theory. Now, does this denigrate the great work the agencies involved have done in the arrests? No. Does it mean that people will be prosecuted in a court of law for criminal acts, and then if they're prosecuted and they're then punished, there's deep value in that as a society? I think there's deep value, social value and psychological value for the Australian psyche around seeing these people held to account. But certainly for the average member of the public, I don't think you should be fooling yourselves that this means the end of organised crime, and that somehow it's going to fall over.
And I'll second that too. Is the seizures just get bigger and bigger? We're seeing the operations get bigger and bigger. It's not necessarily because the police do have the more resource, but the crime is there to be captured. And you only need one innovative approach, and you can get sort of a big raid like this. But it doesn't mean crime's going to stop, and we don't know how it will pivot and how it will come back, in what form it will come back to, particularly when you take out a number of OMCG heads and the like, how else they're going to operate after this. So it's one for the policy thinkers. I mean, I take a cynical view when you get the Prime Minister coming out. Poor old AFP commissioner there has no choice, but, they take that political flavour into that, and to say, look, we've been funding the AFP, and this is due to our political motivations and work. That's one danger, where the policymakers feel it's an easy win for them, without thinking into the longer term implications of this and what other crime prevention avenues they should be taking, so it doesn't get to this scale in the first place, right?
But this is the interesting part about it, Chris. I mean, you and I both know, and I think that most people who think about it, politically, there's a great value. Politically, there's great value about standing in front of, two armed police officers with a drug table filled full of drugs.
They love it.
Well, they do, but also it has deep psychological value to the general Australian public. That's why they love it. So it gives you a tangible something that you can see of why we're spending so much on law enforcement. But you're right. Like, the biggest same thing here. So central to all of this. So we'll put the money aside and put in terms of the laundering of proceeds of crime. I think that if you put all of that aside, what you find is that this is about drugs. This is about profit making and drugs. Okay, so our national strategy in Australia is like a three-legged stool. So on one side is supply reduction, and the theory there is that you take out the supply, reduce the supply, the price goes up, and people will consume less and buy less because they can't afford to. The other two legs, demand reduction, which is done through a range of different processes, including education, and on the other side is harm minimisation. Now, combined together, they make a drug strategy and a strategy to defeat organised crime, done on their own. And the deep, sad reality for the Australian public is that for some reason, Australians, and young Australians mostly, but a range of Australians consume more drugs more often and appear to be price insensitive. And now that's the challenge we have in terms. We bought ourselves some space through the work. Now, a lot of opportunity cost loss here as well, Chris. Like, the law enforcement and courts are going to be locked up for years doing briefs of evidence. The mountains of paperwork and required, and the cost of doing that. I'm not saying it's really important for that prosecutorial outcome, but at the same time,
it's a fair question. If everyone pleads not guilty and takes this to trial, there's got. You're right. It's going to take years. I don't think
that's it.
Yeah.
And lots of resources, which is the other part. It's not just a time issue.
Do you think there's been enough discussion around that broader national drug strategy and the approach out of this operation? Have you heard anything like that?
Look, I
know you've raised it in your commentary, but
I think the Prime Minister's statement, Chris, was really the Australian Prime Minister's statement was really telling on this, saying we have to be hard on this. Those who've been around long enough, just say no to drugs. Thank you to the Reagans. Whilst it was a powerful message, it didn't really make any difference. I was having this conversation earlier today, about, couldn't we do something? And I've appeared between a parliamentary inquiry about this, which is, couldn't we do something like we did for the AIDS campaign, big advertisements? And I'm like, well, we could. It may have some impact, but the thing is that, young people think they're going to live forever. So, a big scary ad that shows someone addicted to a drug, that doesn't necessarily resonate with today's young people, because they don't trust the means that it's being communicated to them. And secondly, is that most young people think they're going to live forever, and the evidence in terms of drug consumption tends to agree with that. So, it's some tough policy work. So, no, I don't think we've done enough to get our heads around that. And we're certainly not having those sorts of conversations. If you remember back to the heroin crisis in this country, nothing more powerful than then Prime Minister Bob Hawke standing up in front of the Australian people on live media, crying, saying that his daughter was a heroin addict, because then it took it from being this is about low socioeconomic kids and underprivileged kids to this is a problem for everybody. Yeah. And I don't think we've had that discussion. And I think for those in New South Wales, we almost did that when Neville Rand's daughter was arrested for methamphetamine use. But I think, we've still got a long way to go in having that conversation here in Australia.
Well, we're starting to have it a little bit. I mean, there in Canberra is the cannabis deregulation, is it? Is that deregulated? It's not legislated?
It's not legislated, no.
Not legalised, sorry.
Look, it's no longer my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this. It has here, personal possession has been decriminalised.
Yeah.
So, that's an important, well, that's a step in one direction.
But the sky hasn't fallen.
No, I don't think it has. And it's similar, we saw, until COVID came along, we saw two music festivals here in Canberra. The same music festival Groove in the Move over 2 years where pill testing was done. And arguably, there's some kids walking around. Well, I shouldn't say kids because I'm not, some young adults walking around, who are alive today because the drugs that they were going to take were tested and found to contain other substances. So, and the world didn't end then either. So, it all depends, I guess. And let's put it another way, in a very personal way. I often say and I've said this to the New South Wales government before, which is, if you're asking me, and I have a young son, but if you're asking me, would I prefer my son die of a drug overdose or that his pills get tested? I prefer his pills get tested. But, if you ask me whether or not I prefer he use drugs or not, I most definitely don't want him to use drugs ever, illicit drugs.
And do whatever you can so he doesn't even go there in the first place.
But if you can't do that, then I want him to try to be as safe as possible, and that's a tough discussion to be had. And I still think, and some of these things, even when I have these conversations about it, look, I just can't imagine, seeing. To me, there's no safe usage of methamphetamine and for recreation nor heroin. So that's a tough one, and I struggle with that and wrestle with that concept all the time. But I do know this, which is I'm not convinced that we should be criminalising those who use illicit drugs.
Well, part of the implications, what we wanted to look at was at least trying to get an evidence-based, mature conversation around narcotics and the illegal and the illicit drug trade, and hopefully this operation might assist that somehow, even with the intelligence collected on how they're operating and hopefully understanding the different layers of that trade, and knowing that some legalization or decriminalization might assist. I think the biggest one there, we won't touch on it too much further, is the ongoing prosecutions and the support requirements and the resources there. Maybe it's something it's maybe too early to call, but definitely there's going to be needing some longer term court strategy involved in trying to manage these. There's some 520 charges, but there's 224 people with another 60 this week, and ongoing investigations. It may well require some additional, and court security is another one. There's going to be some threats and risks around the people involved in these charges.
Look, I suspect so, and this is where it's always better. The AFP Commissioner made it very clear last week that there's probably going to be some scores to be settled out of this. There's a lot of people who owe a lot of people a lot of money, and we're going to see that play out. And there's some people who feel cheated and betrayed, and they're going to see that play out. I can't see this is going to be a long-term activity that needs to be funded. But this is why also, and I raised this just a little bit earlier, which is this criticality of understanding our vulnerabilities. So this has brought us some breathing space and some intelligence. We need to use that to work out how do we stop the next generation of professional facilitators from becoming professional facilitators, so we can avoid putting them in court. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space, and I think that some of it requires just as much innovation and new thinking, because the simple thing of let's push some more legislation through and create more laws around this, I don't think is the answer either. Slowly blocking it off. I think that we need to take a really cold hard look here and understand, well, where are the vulnerabilities? So let's take the public debate now on maritime identity cards at the border. So that's been stuck here in Canberra in legislation, I think, for 2 years. I don't think that's a magic solution. It's got to be one part of a range of issues that are put in place to shut off those vulnerabilities in our border environment.
Okay, well, look, we've gone for about 40 minutes, and without sort of digging a hole into other areas, I think it's a good one to look at. It's only about a week or so after the initial announcements out, and it's definitely one to watch. So, John, it's great to have you on and take the opportunity to take a look at it. For those in the audience, just put Operation Ironside into the back of your mind. so you're aware of it and you can keep tabs on how this develops over time. And then also those longer term, short, medium and longer term implications for organised crime, policing, and national approaches to drug and harm minimisation, as John pointed out with his stool approach. So on that note, John, I'm going to let you go, and there you go.
Thanks,
Dr.
mate.
John Coyne, Head of Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and his thoughts around the implications of Operation Ironside, which harnessed an encrypted app and captured underworld circles worldwide. Thank you, John. Appreciate you going, mate. And just to finish off for me, where's my slide? Here we go. Just the report of the day, as I do, and just get rid of that too. So the report of the day, Ivanti just came out with a CISO survey, how the pandemic has shifted CISO priorities. This one, 90% of CISOs claim that mobile devices have now become the focal point of their cybersecurity strategies, and 86% of CISOs will increase their investment in specialized UEM software in 2021, that unified endpoint management. And it's definitely something that we're hearing, particularly say from the vendor community as well, on their endpoint management solutions and endpoint security. And one other highlight from the day, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre here in Australia has released ransomware prevention and protection guides and an emergency response guide. So what to do to protect yourself against ransomware attacks, and what to do if you're held ransom. Very important, but also very timely. We released an article today on McDonald's, was also a recent victim, that's what the word I was looking for, victim of cybersecurity and a cyber attack. Just a highlight on our Security Consultant series continues next Tuesday, looking at video surveillance systems and crime prevention through environmental design. We'll also have Brian De Carey's, the Chief Executive Officer with the Australian Security Industry Association, on, looking at recognising the critical role of the frontline security industry. And also, we mentioned ransomware there, defending critical infrastructure from ransomware attacks with SIDEF there in Canada. That's next Thursday. So thanks for tuning in. That's enough from us at the Marketplace, and look forward to welcoming you next Tuesday. If not, we'll be back this Friday. Thank you very much.